Welcome, boys and girls. Today I'm going to read you a story entitled Melisande, and it is a story retold from E. Nesbit. Now let me tell you a little bit about E. Nesbit. Nesbit was born in London, England. She had 5 children and wrote poems, articles, and children's stories to earn money. However, she used the initial E rather than her full name, Edith, to disguise the fact that she was a woman. She wrote more than 40 books for children and created the idea of mixing real-life characters and settings with magical elements. So we're going to read this story entitled Melisande. When the Princess Melisande was born, her mother wished to have a christening party, but the king put his foot down and said no. "I've seen too much trouble come of christening parties," he said. "However carefully you draw up the guest list, one fairy is sure to get left out. And you know what that leads to." "Perhaps you're right," sighed the queen. "My cousin forgot a stuffy old fairy when she was sending out the invitations for her daughter's christening. The old wrench turned up at the last minute, and the girl drops toads out of her mouth to this day." "Just so," said the king. "We won't ask a single fairy to the christening. Then none of them can be offended." "Unless they all are," said the queen. And that was exactly what happened. When the king and queen and the baby got back from the christening, the butler met them at the door looking flustered. "Please, your majesties, there are 700 very angry fairies waiting for you in the throne room," he told them hurriedly. With a sigh, the queen opened the door and began. "I'm very sorry." "Hold your tongue," interrupted the most wicked fairy. Her name was Melisande, and she said this very rudely. "Don't make excuses," she said. "You know what happens if a fairy is left out of a christening party. We are all going to give our presents now. I will begin. The princess shall be bald." Well, the queen nearly fainted as Melisande drew back, and another fairy in a smart black bonnet with snakes on it stepped forward, reading the curse to the baby too. But the king held up his hand firmly. "Oh, no, you don't," he said. "Have none of you ladies been to fairy school? Surely you know that a fairy who breaks the traditions of fairy history goes out like the flame of a candle. And the tradition shows that only one bad fairy ever cast a spell at a christening party. So Melisande has spoken, and that's it. No one else. Do I make myself clear?" Several of the old fairies began to murmur that exactly the king was right. "Try it if you don't believe me," said the king. "Who's going to be the first to risk it?" Well, no one answered, and the fairies began to slink quietly out the door. When the very last fairy had gone, the queen ran to the baby and looked. She tore off her little cap and fought to hold back the tears at the sight, for all the baby's downy golden hair came off with the cap. Princess Melisande was as bald as an egg. "It's okay, my love," said the king. "I have a wish lying by, one which I've never had occasion to use. My fairy godmother gave it to me for a wedding present, but since then I've had nothing to wish for." "Thank you, dear," said the queen, smiling in spite of herself. "I'll keep the wish till the baby grows up," the king said. "Then I'll give it to her, and if she would like to wish for hair, she can." So Princess Melisande grew up as beautiful as the sunshine and as good as gold, but never a hair grew on her head. On the day of her 18th birthday, the king unlocked his gold safe and took out the wish and gave it to his daughter. Melisande thought for a moment and then came up with a suitable wish. "Father, I wish that all your subjects should be quite happy." But they were already, because the king and queen were so good. So the wish still remained. Then Melisande said, "I wish them all to be good." But they were all already good because they were happy. So again the wish hung fire. "Dearest, for my sake, wish what I tell you," said the queen, and she whispered into Melisande's ear. Then Melisande said aloud, I wish I had golden hair a yard long, and that it would grow an inch every day and grow twice as fast every time it was cut, until it was so long it weighed as much as me." "Stop!" cried the king in alarm, but the wish had come true, and the very next moment the princess stood smiling at him through a shower of golden hair. "What's the matter, dear?" the queen asked. "You'll find out soon enough," answered the king. And indeed they did. The princess' hair began by being a yard long, and it grew an inch every night. In about 5 weeks, her hair was about 2 yards long. It trailed on the floor and swept up all the dust. And still the princess' hair was growing an inch every night. When it was 3 yards long, it was so heavy that Melisande could no longer bear it. So she took some scissors and she cut it all off. For a few hours she was comfortable. But the hair went on growing, and now it grew twice as fast as before, so that in 36 days it was as long as ever. The poor princess cried with tiredness, but when she couldn't bear it any more, she cut her hair and was comfortable for a few short moments. But the hair now grew 4 times as fast as at first. In 18 days, it was as long as before, and she had to have it cut again. Then it grew 8 inches a day, and after the next cut, it grew 16 inches a day, and so on, growing twice as fast every cut, until the princess went to bed at night with her hair clipped short and woke up in the morning with golden hair flowing all about the room. The royal hairdresser had to come, cut it all off, and before she could even get into bed. "Oh, I wish I was bald again," sighed Melisande often. One day the king came across her weeping bitterly. "I shall write to my fairy godmother," he said to the queen, "and see if something cannot be done." So he wrote, and he sent the letter by a skylark, and in return came this answer: "Why not advertise for a competent prince? Offer the usual reward." The king sent out his heralds all over the world to proclaim that any respectable prince could marry Princess Melisande if he could somehow stop her hair from growing. From far and near came hordes of princes anxious to try their luck. They brought all sorts of nasty remedies with them in bottles and jars and boxes, but none of them worked. And Melisande was glad, for she didn't like any of the princes. Melisande now had to sleep in the great throne room, as it was the only room big enough to contain all her hair. One night she was sitting at the window when she saw a new arrival walking in the garden in the moonlight. For the first time she found herself wishing that a prince might actually have the power to stop her hair from growing. The prince looked up and said, "You are Princess Melisande? I am Prince Florizel. There's a sturdy-looking tree just below your window. May I climb up to you?" "Surely," said the princess. So he climbed up to the window. "Now," he said, smiling kindly, "if I can do what your father asked, would you want to marry me?" "Oh, yes," she replied. "I need a kiss to seal the promise," he said. And the princess gladly gave him a kiss, and then another, so as not to be thought mean, and one more just for luck. The next day the prince ordered for a pair of giant gold-winged scales to be made. When they were ready, he brought them out to the palace gardens under the branches of the big oak tree. "Do you trust me?" he asked Princess Melisande, taking her hand. "Of course I do," she replied. Then Florizel took her down into the garden and helped her to sit up on one side of the scale. "What is going on to the other side of the scale?" asked Melisande. "Your hair," said Florizel. "You see, your hair has not been able to tell when it's the same weight as you. So, if we measure it and snip it off at exactly the right weight, it should not go on growing anymore." So, when Melisande was ready, Prince Florizel swung his sword and cut off the prince's hair, and at once it began to grow at a frightful rate. The king and queen busily packed the hair onto the other scale as it grew, and gradually the scale began to go down. The prince stood waiting between the scales with his sword drawn, and just before the two were equal, he struck. In the seconds it took his sword to flash through the air, Melisand's hair grew still more. So at the very moment when he struck his sword, the scales were in perfect balance. The scale, full of golden hair, bumped down into the ground. Prince Florizel hurried to help Melisande out of the other side of the scale. And at last the princess stood there before those who loved her, both laughing and crying with happiness, because her hair was finally short and not growing anymore. She kissed her handsome Prince Florizel 100 times, and the very next day they were married in a joyful celebration with a great feast and lots of dancing. And of course, every single fairy in the kingdom was invited. And that's the end of our story, boys and girls. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed our story today. Keep watching for our activity of the day.